It was the summer of 1958. The sun was high, the Atlantic shimmered beneath the colossal cruise ship SS Marine Solace, and families on board were soaking in the last few days of vacation. Among them were the Devine family, James and Margaret, with their 2 children, Daniel, aged 7, and Louis, aged 5. The family was from Ohio and had saved for years to afford this trip, a week-long voyage from New York to the Bahamas and back. For the Devines, this cruise was meant to be a dream, a rare escape from routine. But it would soon become the kind of nightmare most parents can't even bring themselves to imagine. On the 4th day of the trip, somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, the boys were playing in one of the ship's designated children's areas, an open-air playground built on the top deck near the bow, close to the crew quarters. It was a bright morning just before 10 a.m. when Margaret last saw her boys. She had walked them to the playground herself, watched them climb the small slide, and then returned to the lounge to join her husband for coffee. They were just a hallway away. The playground was not supervised, something common at the time. There were no cameras, no security guards, and few other passengers in that area during the early hours. But the boys were used to playing alone, and the ship was considered safe, until they vanished. At 10:45 a.m., Margaret returned to check on her sons. The playground was empty. Thinking they had perhaps gotten bored or wandered to the nearby vending area, she did a quick sweep. No sign of them. She and James split up and searched the ship for over an hour before alerting staff. By noon, the captain had been notified, and a full ship-wide announcement was made. All passengers were asked to return to their cabins while crew members combed every corner of the ship. But the boys were gone. Panic surged. The ship wasn't due to dock for another day, and no one had seen Daniel or Louis since the early morning. No child had been reported crying or lost. No one remembered seeing them near the railings, and according to crew logs, there was no way for them to simply leave the ship. The captain ordered a halt in the voyage. The ship stopped, hovering in open waters, while helicopters and Coast Guard boats were dispatched. For nearly 18 hours, search teams scanned the ocean. Divers were deployed, but there were no traces. No clothing, no shoes, no bodies, no screams heard. Nothing. And then, just as the media began to swarm the story, an unexpected clue washed ashore. 2 days after the SS Marine Solace returned to port, empty of the Devine brothers and heavy with unanswered questions, a local fisherman named Roy Halperin was walking along a stretch of beach near Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. It was early morning, gray skies, choppy surf, and the kind of salty wind that stung the eyes. About a mile from his usual fishing spot, he noticed something strange wedged between a cluster of washed-up seaweed and driftwood. A small, waterlogged suitcase. The suitcase was old-fashioned, made of brown leather with brass latches. What made it stand out wasn't just that it had clearly been in the water. It was that one of the latches was broken, bent outward, like it had been forced open, or closed in a hurry. Roy, curious and a bit unsettled, dragged it up the beach and called the local sheriff. When the authorities opened the suitcase, what they found shocked everyone. Inside were several items that, at first glance, seemed random. A child's sneaker, soaked and half-decayed. A small wooden toy car, chipped and water-damaged. A strip of blue cloth that might have once been part of a shirt. And most disturbingly, a crumpled, torn photo of 2 boys. Though it was partially destroyed by water, the faces were just visible enough. Margaret Devine confirmed it immediately. It was her sons. The FBI got involved quickly, taking the suitcase in for analysis. The theory that the boys had fallen overboard now seemed unlikely. How would their belongings, intact and packed together, end up in a suitcase, miles away, on land? And why would a suitcase wash up with no signs of damage or barnacle buildup, suggesting it hadn't been floating for long? The new leading theory sent chills through everyone involved. The boys had been abducted, but the cruise ship had never docked, and no crew members were reported missing. The manifest was airtight, every passenger accounted for. So how could someone have smuggled two boys off a ship in the middle of the Atlantic? Investigators turned to a darker possibility: human trafficking. At the time, trafficking was barely understood, let alone widely investigated. But the pattern was there. The suitcase, neatly packed, with just enough of the boys' belongings to suggest someone had time and intention. Perhaps the abductor had planned this well in advance. Perhaps the boys were lured, tricked, or even drugged before being taken below deck. Perhaps a crew member was involved. The media exploded. Headlines like "Divine Mystery Deepens" and "Suitcase Sparks Kidnapping Theory" flooded front pages. Parents across America grew paranoid. Cruise lines came under intense scrutiny. But there was still one glaring hole. No one had seen anything. No security footage. No suspicious activity logged. Not a single passenger recalled seeing the boys with a stranger. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, and someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. But then, as the weeks turned into months, a second witness came forward. A woman from Charleston, a retired school teacher who had been on the cruise. And she claimed to have seen something that, at the time, didn't make sense, but now couldn't be ignored. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, 63 years old, sharp-minded, with a reputation in her town for never missing a detail. A retired schoolteacher and avid cruiser, Eleanor had taken the SS Marine Solace trip with her bridge club. At first, she hadn't thought much about what she'd seen, until she read the newspaper article about the suitcase. It triggered something. Eleanor called the FBI office in Charleston and insisted on speaking to someone in person. She described an encounter that occurred on the morning of the boys' disappearance. Around 10:15 a.m., while walking back to her cabin on Deck 4, she passed by a storage corridor used mostly by staff. The door was slightly ajar. That alone was unusual. It was typically locked. But what caught her attention was the soft sound of a child crying. She paused. It wasn't loud, more like a whimper, tired, muffled, like someone trying not to cry out loud. Eleanor leaned closer, peering through the crack in the door. Inside it was dark. She could barely make anything out, but she remembered seeing a shadow move quickly. A tall figure, maybe wearing a white uniform. Then, silence. The door closed, firmly, from the inside. She hadn't thought about it again until the reports started circulating. The kids, the toy in the suitcase, the photograph. Something clicked. She felt sick. It wasn't just a coincidence. The FBI took her seriously, very seriously. Investigators focused on Deck 4, cross-referencing crew schedules and storage access logs. That's when they discovered another anomaly, a missing maintenance record. The logbook that was supposed to document every room cleaning, equipment check, and key access for that corridor on the day of the disappearance had one blank entry: 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. No initials, no task code, nothing. They questioned the crew, but after 2 weeks at sea and mounting media pressure, most had either been rotated to other ships or terminated. One man, a janitor from Colombia named Carlos Jimenez, never showed up for debrief. He had been scheduled to work in that exact area. According to the cruise line, Carlos had left the country after disembarking, but further digging revealed no departure records, no passport activity, no flight logs. He had simply disappeared. Now there were 3 missing persons. A pattern was forming, but evidence was thin. With no cameras and no physical proof tying Carlos or anyone else to the boys, the FBI had little to work with. No DNA, no fingerprints, only a suitcase and a vague witness account. Still, Eleanor's testimony led to a disturbing realization. Whoever had taken Daniel and Louis knew the ship intimately. They knew the blind spots, the schedules, the soft spots in security. This wasn't opportunistic. It was calculated. The case grew colder with every passing week. Tips came in from across the country, sightings of the boys in Miami, whispers of child trafficking rings operating along the East Coast. But every lead ended in a dead end. Until 3 months later, when a second piece of evidence surfaced. An audio tape, anonymous, mailed directly to the Devine family's home. No return address, no fingerprints, just a short, chilling recording that would change everything. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, sealed in a plain manila envelope with no markings beyond the address. Handwritten, shaky, like someone trying to disguise their script. Inside, there was no letter, no message, just a small, reel-to-reel magnetic audio tape, the kind used in portable recorders during the 1950s. The Devine family stared at it for hours, afraid to play it. Eventually, James brought it to the local police, who rushed it to the FBI for analysis. The audio was short, just under 2 minutes, and what it captured chilled even the most seasoned investigators. It began with static. Then, faint ocean sounds, waves, creaking metal, like a hull groaning under pressure. Then, the unmistakable voice of a child. "Danny, are we going home now?" A pause. Another voice, slightly older. "I don't know. I think we're on a boat." Then footsteps. Heavy. Measured. And then the tape cut to silence. But just before the end, barely audible, a man's voice whispered, almost directly into the microphone, "They don't belong to you anymore." The voice was deep, accented, hard to place. The tape was sent to forensic audio specialists, who determined it had likely been recorded in a small enclosed space, possibly a storage container. The background sounds were consistent with being inside a cargo area or the lower decks of a ship, but not the Marine Solace, which meant the boys had been transferred. Now the FBI had a terrifying new theory. The boys were taken from the playground, hidden in a maintenance corridor by someone who knew the schedule. They were possibly sedated or carried while unconscious, then moved off the Marine Solace, not in port, but via a secondary vessel, a smaller boat, something covert. One witness came forward, a deckhand who remembered seeing a small service boat tailing the Solace on the day of the disappearance. He assumed it was a maintenance or supply transfer, common at the time, but when they checked the ship's logs, there was no record of any such boat that day. No delivery, no boarding. It was never reported. The implication was clear. The operation had help. Someone on board had coordinated a handoff at sea. The Devines were devastated. The more information surfaced, the clearer it became. This wasn't random. It was systematic, organized, possibly part of a larger network. But there was something even more sinister. After the tape was analyzed, authorities tried to trace its origin. The postmark was from Savannah, Georgia, but the tape itself had traces of sea salt embedded in the reels, suggesting it had spent time in a marine environment. And then came the most disturbing discovery. When the FBI enhanced the background of the tape, isolating noise layers, they uncovered something faint, almost imperceptible beneath the voices. A song. An old, haunting lullaby, one that didn't match any known American children's tune. A melody with lyrics in a foreign language. Later identified as an Eastern European cradle song, traditionally sung by Roma communities. Now the investigation turned international. The new theory? The boys had been taken not just for trafficking, but by a group that had done this before. A transnational operation with roots stretching across oceans. But before the agents could follow up, a fire destroyed part of the FBI's evidence warehouse, and the original tape was lost. The fire started just after 3 a.m. on a cold December morning in 1958, only weeks after the tape had been received. The FBI storage facility in Quantico, Virginia, one of the Bureau's most secure evidence depots, was suddenly engulfed in flames. The cause was officially labeled as an electrical fault, but many agents on the inside were skeptical. The timing was too perfect. And the damage? Surgical. Of the hundreds of storage lockers, only 5 were completely destroyed, one of them being the unit that held all physical evidence related to the Divine case. The suitcase, the toy car, the sneaker, the blue cloth, even the enhanced audio copies of the mysterious tape, all gone, just like the boys. The incident didn't go unnoticed by the media, but the official narrative downplayed its relevance. "Unfortunate loss due to faulty wiring," read the headlines. But for those close to the case, especially Special Agent Marion Blake, it was the final proof that someone didn't want the truth to come out. Blake had been assigned to the case since day one. Quiet, methodical, and obsessed with closure, she was the one who had pushed to have the audio analyzed. Now, with no physical evidence left, she began her own off-the-record investigation, focusing on the only angle still left open: international leads. She contacted Interpol, using the lullaby from the tape as her anchor. With the help of linguistic experts, they traced the song to a small region in Transcarpathia, near the borders of Ukraine, Slovakia, and Hungary, a region known for nomadic groups, smuggling routes, and during the post-war years, a black market for everything from weapons to children. Blake traveled there in early 1959 under the radar. What she found was a tight-lipped community, steeped in folklore and distrustful of outsiders. But after weeks of effort, she was led, through a series of coded exchanges and anonymous notes, to an old man in a remote mountain village. He was blind, nearly 90, but when Blake played the surviving hum of the lullaby from her notes, he began to cry. He said the song was called Nad du Hom, translated loosely as Above the Fog. It was traditionally sung to orphans, particularly those taken in by traveling caravans. The lyrics were not comforting, but cautionary. Warnings to the child to forget the past, to sleep, and not to ask where their mother was. The lullaby, he said, was never sung publicly, only to the new ones. The implication was chilling. These were children taken from elsewhere, rehomed, repurposed. The lullaby wasn't a comfort, it was a command. Forget who you were. Back in the US, Blake compiled her findings, but without the original tape or suitcase, the FBI had little interest in pursuing what they deemed folkloric speculation. The official case remained open, but inactive. Her report was shelved. By the end of 1959, the Divine case had faded from the headlines. The family moved to a small town in Oregon, hoping to escape the media circus. But they never stopped searching. And then, nearly 6 years later, something unexplainable happened. In 1964, a photograph surfaced in Marseille, France. It showed 2 boys, no older than 12, standing near a docked freighter. They looked almost identical to Daniel and Louis. Same hair color, same eye shape, same gap in the front teeth. The photo was blurry, taken from a distance, but when shown to Margaret Devine, she collapsed in tears. She was certain. The boys were alive. The photograph arrived by mail. No letter, no explanation. Just a worn black and white print folded inside a plain envelope postmarked from Paris. On the back, written in blue ink, was a single sentence in broken English. "They still live." James Devine opened it first. It took him nearly a minute to process what he was seeing. 2 boys standing side by side, next to a rusted shipping container at the edge of a crowded dock. The sea behind them was gray. Gulls circled overhead. Both boys looked thin but healthy. Their clothes were mismatched, and one wore shoes far too large. But the expressions, the eyes, were unmistakable. Daniel and Louis, or so it seemed. The photo was immediately sent to the FBI, where forensic analysts conducted a comparison with the last known images of the boys. While the photo was grainy and slightly out of focus, the bone structure aligned. The ear shape, the tilt of Louis's head. Even the way Daniel rested his hand on his brother's shoulder. just like he used to. But there was a problem. According to customs and immigration records, no American children matching their description had ever entered France between 1958 and 1964. There was no trace of their names, no birth certificates, no school enrollment, nothing. Blake, who had been unofficially tracking the case, flew to Marseille herself. The dock where the photo was taken was part of a defunct shipping yard, once used for importing goods from North Africa. Now it was nearly abandoned, except for a few night workers and transient dockhands. When Blake showed the photograph around, some shrugged. Others averted their eyes. But one old man, a Moroccan fisherman named Hamid, remembered. He said 2 boys, like the ones in the photo, had been seen around the docks in the early 60s. They never spoke much, didn't beg, just wandered. Always together. A woman in her 40s, a redhead with a heavy accent, was sometimes seen walking a few steps behind them. She never touched them, never spoke in public. But the boys always followed her when she left. Hamid remembered because the woman had a scar across her cheek, a deep one. Blake had the detail drawn up and sent to Interpol. Within days, they had a match. The woman was Anita Kovac, a Hungarian national wanted in connection with multiple cases of child smuggling across Eastern Europe. She had been arrested once in Prague in 1952, but released due to lack of evidence. Since then, she had vanished. No sightings, no trace. But now there was a potential link. Interpol launched an operation to track Anita, but she was a ghost. No passports, no property. Only rumors, always a step behind. Then a break. A dock worker in Genoa, Italy, claimed to have seen the woman and the boys boarding a ship heading south, months before the photo surfaced. The name of the freighter was the Lysistrata, a vessel registered in Liberia but operated by a shadowy consortium with ties to multiple offshore shell companies. The Lysistrata had no scheduled stops between ports, no passenger lists, no cargo records that matched its declared weight. But after leaving Genoa, it disappeared from radar for 8 full days before docking quietly in Tripoli, Libya. From there, all trails ended. Years passed. The Divines received no more photos, no more tapes, just silence. Until 1972, 14 years after the boys disappeared, when a woman in Buenos Aires filed a report about a neighbor's children who spoke fluent English with no Argentine accent, despite having allegedly been born in the countryside. She said the older one called the younger Louis. Buenos Aires, 1972. In a quiet neighborhood just outside the city center, a retired school nurse named Beatriz Molina filed a report with the local authorities after a strange interaction with her new neighbors. The family had recently moved into a modest home on her street. A woman and 2 teenage boys who seemed polite, reserved, but out of place. What caught Beatriz's attention wasn't their appearance. It was their language. She was fluent in English, having studied abroad in her youth. One afternoon, while walking past the house, she overheard the boys talking. "Louis, come inside before she gets mad," one of them said. The voice was clear. American. Not just English. American accented, Midwestern, precise. She turned. The younger boy looked directly at her. The same freckled face she'd seen in the newspaper over a decade ago. Her heart raced. The next day, she went to the authorities. But by the time they arrived, the house was empty. The family had vanished overnight. No forwarding address, no rental records, no school enrollments. Only a few items left behind. A broken wristwatch, a pair of worn-out Converse sneakers, and a hand-carved toy car, sanded smooth with time. Interpol was alerted, and soon, the case was back on international radar. A composite sketch based on Beatriz's description was compared against photos of Daniel and Louis Divine from 1958. The resemblance was once again undeniable. But without DNA or modern forensics, there was still no way to confirm their identity. Special Agent Blake, now retired, was brought back in as a consultant. When she flew to Buenos Aires to examine the items left behind, something struck her immediately. The toy car. It was nearly identical to the one found in the suitcase in 1958. Same shape. Same hand-painted red streak across the roof. She was convinced. But Blake's return brought more questions than answers. If the boys had been alive, hidden for all these years, why had they never tried to escape? Why hadn't they contacted their parents? Were they being controlled? Brainwashed? Threatened? Local investigators soon uncovered whispers of an underground network. A clandestine group operating across South America, focused on rehoming lost children from war-torn or impoverished regions. But there were darker rumors that some children were used as false adoptees, smuggled into wealthy homes, given new identities, and expected to forget who they once were. When investigators traced the ownership of the house the boys had fled from, they hit another wall. The lease had been paid in Swiss francs, funneled through a shell company registered in Panama, which in turn was managed by an anonymous trust based in Luxembourg. Blake's theory solidified. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a system, a machine with money, influence, and silence on its side. For months, she tracked leads across the continent, from Santiago to Montevideo. Every time, she was one step behind. The same pattern repeated. A tip, a photo, a description, and then nothing. Gone again. Until one day in 1975, a journalist from Brazil reached out with something unexpected. He had stumbled upon a private boarding school in the hills of São Paulo. Exclusive, isolated, off the grid, and inside, among the faded class photos from 1965, was an image that made Blake's heart stop. Two boys, standing beside each other. Same height difference, same faces. On the back of the photo, David and Lucas, class of '65. The photo was real. Verified by the school's archives, it dated back to 1965. The names listed were David and Lucas, no last names. The headmaster at the time had passed away, and the current staff knew little about that era. The school claimed no official records existed of their admission. According to enrollment logs, there was no trace of those two boys ever attending. And yet, the photo hung on the wall of the main office, tucked between other class portraits, like it had always been there. Blake flew to São Paulo immediately. She met with local authorities, who secured a warrant to access what remained of the school's private files. What they uncovered only deepened the mystery. In 1964, a group of children was admitted under special exemption status, a program allegedly sponsored by an unnamed philanthropic organization. The names were vague. Most had only first names listed. Ages were approximate. No guardians were documented. And then, after 1967, all traces of those children vanished from the registry. One night, Blake managed to speak with a retired groundskeeper who had worked at the school during that period. When shown the photograph, his hands trembled. They were good boys, quiet, always watched each other's backs. He remembered the older one, David, often took the blame when rules were broken. He remembered how Lucas clung to him. But what haunted the old man most was how suddenly they disappeared. One day they were there. The next, their room was empty. No goodbye, no explanation. The room they had once shared had since been converted into a supply closet. Blake stood in the middle of it, staring at the narrow space, trying to imagine what those lost boys had felt. Taken from their home, given new names, rewritten, erased. Back in the U.S., the Divine family never gave up hope. They kept every article, every letter, every copy of the photo from Marseille and Buenos Aires. James passed away in 1981, still believing his sons were alive. Margaret died in 1993, her final request etched on her gravestone. May they find their way home. No conclusive evidence ever surfaced. DNA testing was decades away when most leads went cold. and by the time technology caught up, the trail had faded into whispers. But stories remained. In 1999, a British backpacker reported meeting an older man in Patagonia who spoke fluent English but refused to give his real name. He was quiet, solitary, and carried a carved wooden toy in his bag. When asked about it, he reportedly said, "My brother made it, a long time ago." And in 2007, a woman visiting a remote monastery in Romania photographed a mural painted by a local artist. It depicted two boys in 1950s clothing, standing hand in hand, staring at the sea. The artist, when questioned, said he had dreamed the image again and again for years, though he didn't know who they were. Today, the case of Daniel and Louis Devine remains unsolved. No bodies, no proof of death, no concrete sightings, just fragments, photos, memories, and questions. Some believe they were trafficked. Others think they escaped and lived quiet, anonymous lives in exile. A few believe they're still alive, somewhere, waiting for someone to recognize them. And maybe, just maybe, they've never stopped trying to come home.